The exploration of space will go ahead, whether we join in it or not. And it is one of the great adventures of all time. And no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space.
What if I told you that while the world watched rockets lift off and history unfold on television, entire branches of space exploration were already operating beyond public oversight, classified not for decades, but for generations? Not as a single project, but as a network of compartmentalized programs buried within military, aerospace, and intelligence structures, operating under levels of secrecy most citizens were never informed existed. Over time, researchers, whistleblowers, and insiders would begin referring to this hidden infrastructure by a single name: the secret space program. Most people think that the secret space program is just another conspiracy theory, something entertaining to speculate about, but not something that could actually affect their life. That assumption alone is part of the problem, because if even a fraction of what has been leaked, testified to, and quietly acknowledged over decades is true, then it means humanity has been living inside a carefully managed version of reality. Not just politically, not just technologically, but existentially. This isn't about aliens as entertainment, okay? It isn't about science fiction, or even spaceships or futuristic fantasies. This is about who controls access to advanced technology, off-world operations, time-altering systems, and non-public knowledge of consciousness itself. And once you see that possibility clearly, you can't unsee it. The question stops being, is this real? And becomes, well, if this is real, why was it hidden? One of the first misconceptions people run into is the idea that the secret space program is one single operation run by one authority with one unified agenda. It isn't. There is no one SSP. There is no singular command structure. There is no monolithic organization secretly running everything behind the scenes. What multiple insiders and whistleblowers consistently describe instead is a fragmented ecosystem of covert programs, factions, and breakaway infrastructures, many of which do not agree with each other, and in some cases are actively in conflict. Some of these factions are military, some are corporate, some appear to be legacy breakaway civilizations that splintered off long ago. Some reportedly involve non-human intelligence. Others focus not on space at all, but on human consciousness itself. Most people have no idea this fragmentation even exists, because the public narrative depends on keeping everything blurred together, or vague, or unbelievable. Here's where things start to get uncomfortable. If advanced propulsion systems, zero-point or free energy technologies, anti-gravity craft, and off-road operations have existed for decades, then energy scarcity is artificial. Technological limits are curated. Public science is incomplete by design, and humanity is being drop-fed a version of progress that benefits someone else. That's not speculation. That's logical consequence of secrecy at that scale. And it forces a much bigger question. If this technology exists, why hasn't it been released? That single question changes how you see governments, disclosure, space exploration, human potential, and even spirituality. Because suddenly disclosure isn't just about aliens, okay? It's about power, sovereignty, and who decides the future of our species. Most people imagine disclosure as a future event, a press conference, a landing, a big announcement that changes everything overnight. But what if disclosure has already been happening for decades, just not in the way people expect? Through fragments, through whistleblowers, through entertainment, through classified budgets, through leaked patents, through testimonies that never quite make headlines. Not to inform humanity, but to condition it. Because full disclosure doesn't just reveal non-human intelligence. It reveals suppressed technology, hidden technology, human experimentation, and a power structure that exists outside of democratic oversight. This is not something you roll out all at once. It has to be normalized slowly, carefully, and selectively. People who seriously engage with this topic often say the same thing. I never saw reality the same way again. That's because secret space program information doesn't just add facts. It rearranges your internal map of the world. You begin to question what you were taught in school, what space really means, whether humanity is truly confined to Earth, and whether consciousness itself is being deliberately misunderstood or misrepresented. This is why the secret space program topic is dismissed, mocked, or buried. Not because it's harmless, but because it's destabilizing. It challenges the idea that humanity is powerless, primitive, or alone. And it raises the possibility that our future has already been negotiated without our consent. This secret space program series isn't about convincing you of anything, okay? It's about expanding the frame you were allowed to think inside. Over the course of this series, we're going to explore why multiple secret space program factions exist, how breakaway civilizations form, how advanced technology and consciousness intersect, why disclosure is never natural, and why discernment matters far more than belief. Some of this may challenge you, some of it may frustrate you, some of it may click in ways you didn't expect. But if you've ever felt that something about reality doesn't add up, then you're in the right place. And to understand how this hidden system actually began, we have to start with the earliest modern faction that multiple accounts consistently point to as the foundation of everything that followed. That faction is known as Solar Warden. To understand how the secret space program emerged, we have to let go of the idea that it appeared suddenly or accidentally. Systems of this scale never do. They evolve quietly in stages, often in response to pressures the public never sees. According to multiple accounts, the root of what later became the secret space program traced back to a period when technology, war, and secrecy converged in unprecedented ways. During World War II, for example, classified aerospace research accelerated far beyond what entered public history. Experimental propulsion systems, unconventional craft designs, and underground research facilities were pursued in absolute secrecy. While the official narrative focuses on jets, rockets, and early missiles, many researchers believe this period also involved breakthroughs that were immediately removed from public science and absorbed into black programs. This was the first moment when technological advancement and secrecy became inseparable. As the war ended, that secrecy didn't dissolve, it expanded. The Cold War created a permanent justification for compartmentalization, black budgets, and programs that operated outside normal oversight. Intelligence agencies grew in power. Military research became increasingly classified, and entire branches of technological development disappeared behind layers of need-to-know access. What mattered was no longer public progress, but strategic advantage. By the time the 1980s arrived, space itself had been redefined. No longer just a frontier for exploration, it was now treated as a strategic domain. This era marked a critical transition point. Publicly, this period was associated with initiatives like the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was framed as a missile defense system designed to protect against nuclear threats. You remember that Ronald Reagan era? To the public, it sounded futuristic, but defensive. To many researchers, it represented something much larger. The Strategic Defense Initiative normalized the idea that space could be weaponized, monitored, and controlled. It justified massive funding streams, advanced satellite systems, and research into technologies far beyond conventional propulsion. More importantly, it provided political cover. It created a framework where space-based infrastructure could be built under the banner of defense, while the true scope of that infrastructure remained classified. In this context, secrecy wasn't an anomaly, it was the operating principle. This is the environment in which the modern secret space program is said to have taken form, not as a single project, but as an ecosystem, a convergence of military objectives, corporate interests, intelligence operations, and technologies that never entered public awareness. And within that ecosystem, one faction consistently appears as the earliest organized space-based fleet. The faction is called Solar Warden. Now, Solar Warden is commonly described as the first modern secret space program fleet, the one to operate beyond Earth in a sustained, structured way. Emerging during the late Cold War to the Strategic Defense Initiative era, it is typically portrayed as a military-oriented program focused on near-Earth space, Earth-Moon operations, and the inner solar system. Unlike later factions, Solar Warden is often described as having a clear chain of command, a disciplined structure, and a defensive mandate. What makes Solar Warden so important isn't just that it came first, it's that it represents a bridge between conventional military logic and the far more complex landscape that followed. Solar Warden wasn't framed as a breakaway civilization or a corporate empire. It was framed as an extension of Earth-based defense thinking, taken off-planet, patrols, monitoring, strategic presence, the same mentality that governs airspace and oceans, but applied to space. According to multiple whistleblowers and insider accounts, Solar Warden functioned as proof of concept. It demonstrated that off-world operations were not only possible, but sustainable. It showed that fleets could be deployed, crews could be trained, and missions could be coordinated beyond Earth without public knowledge. And once that threshold was crossed, there was no going back. Because once space became accessible in secret, it also became contested. Other interests followed. Corporate structures sought control. Intelligence operations expanded. More covert programs splintered off. What began as a military extension quietly evolved into something far more fragmented and far more powerful than any single government. This is why Solar Warden is often described as the foundation of the entire secret space program ecosystem. Not because it controls everything, but because it came first. It set the standard, it set the precedent, and it revealed a truth that could never again be contained. Humanity was no longer limited to Earth, and the future of the species was being shaped far beyond public awareness. Understanding Solar Warden isn't about glorifying it or even demonizing it. It's about recognizing the moment when secrecy crossed a boundary, when space stopped being a shared human horizon and became a classified domain, when technology advanced faster than truth, and when the trajectory of civilization quietly diverged into paths most people were never told existed. And once you understood that, the rest of the secret space program, the factions, the conflicts, the manipulations, and the controlled disclosure we see today begins to make a very different kind of sense. To understand Solar Warden beyond its origin, we have to look at how it actually functioned. According to multiple whistleblower accounts, Solar Warden operated much like a conventional military force, just displaced off-world. Personnel were typically described as having military backgrounds, trained under strict command hierarchies, with missions structured around patrol, monitoring, escort, and strategic positioning. This wasn't a loose or experimental operation. It was disciplined, procedural, and built on chain of command obedience. In this framework, space was treated no differently than airspace or international waters, something to be controlled, observed, and defended. Operations attributed to Solar Warden were generally focused close to Earth, or near Earth orbit, or Earth-Moon space, and portions of the inner solar system appear repeatedly across accounts. The emphasis was not on deep space exploration or colonization, but on presence and awareness, monitoring traffic, tracking unknown craft, maintaining strategic visibility. In this sense, Solar Warden is often described less as an exploratory fleet and more as a space-based patrol force. Its purpose was not discovery, but security. Personnel selection is one of the most telling aspects of Solar Warden. Unlike later programs described as drawing from corporate or intelligence or even civilian pools, Solar Warden crews were most often portrayed as traditional military recruits. This meant discipline, secrecy, and loyalty were prioritized over philosophical questioning. Many accounts suggest that even those serving within Solar Warden had limited awareness of the broader secret space program ecosystem. Compartmentalization existed not just between these factions, but within them. You knew your mission, you knew your role, and you did not ask beyond that. This structure gave Solar Warden stability, but it also imposed limits. Military thinking excels at defense, deterrence, and control, but it struggles when confronted with realities that do not fit conventional threat models. As accounts suggest increasingly encounters with advanced non-human technology, non-terrestrial intelligence, and physics-defying capabilities, Solar Warden's framework began to show strain. The rules that govern terrestrial warfare did not translate cleanly into a multidimensional or non-human context. This is where contradictions began to surface. On one hand, Solar Warden is often described as defensive and Earth-aligned. On the other, it existed entirely outside public consent, democratic oversight, or civilian awareness. It was protecting humanity without humanity knowing it was being protected, or even that protection was needed. That tension alone raises difficult questions. Who decides what constitutes a threat? Who defines defense when the battlefield is invisible to the population being defended? There are also contradictions in how Solar Warden is portrayed over time. Early accounts often frame it as a stabilizing force, but later descriptions suggest it became increasingly sidelined. As corporate interests expanded into space and deeper, more secretive programs emerged. Solar Warden's role appears to have diminished. It did not disappear, but it no longer occupied the central position it once held. In some narratives, it becomes a background force, still operational, but no longer steering the direction of the off-world activity. Another recurring point of tension involves allegiance. While Solar Warden is usually described as Earth-aligned, that alignment is not necessarily synonymous with public governments or civilian interest. Alignment in this context often appears to mean loyalty to a classified command structure rather than to humanity as a whole. This distinction matters. A program can be Earth-based and still operate according to priorities that do not reflect the will, awareness, or well-being of the broader population. Some accounts also describe internal fractures, such as personnel who began to realize the scope of what was being hidden, conflicts over secrecy versus disclosure, disagreements about engagement with non-human intelligence. These fractures did not necessarily lead to rebellion, but they contributed to a broader pattern seen across the SSP ecosystem. Fragmentation. Once the door to off-world operations was opened, unity became increasingly difficult to maintain. Solar Warden's greatest significance may not lie in what it achieved, but in what it revealed. It demonstrates that secrecy could extend beyond Earth, that fleets could operate off-world without public knowledge, that advanced technology could be deployed in silence. And once that reality existed, it set the stage for everything that followed. corporate expansion, deeper black programs, and narratives designed to manage public perception rather than reveal truth. This is why Solar Warden occupies such a pivotal place in any serious examination of the secret space program. It is not the most advanced faction, it is not the most powerful, but it is the threshold. It marks the moment when humanity crossed from speculation into action, from theory into deployment, and from earthbound civilization into something far more complex and far less transparent. The greatest divide in human civilization may not be between nations, ideologies, or belief systems, but between those who live inside the official narrative of reality and those who operate beyond it. And Solar Warden sits precisely at the fault line, where secrecy, power, and the future of humanity quietly intersect. To understand how corporate and intelligent interests overlook military control, we have to recognize a hard truth about power. Military institutions are designed for defense, not ownership. They secure territory, enforce orders, and maintain stability, but they do not ultimately control resources, funding streams, or long-term technological direction. That role belongs elsewhere. Solar Warden, by its very nature, was constrained. It operated under military doctrine, chain of command, and compartmentalization secrecy, but it still depended on funding pipelines, contractors, and research divisions that existed outside its direct authority. Advanced propulsion systems, materials, science, energy generation, and spacecraft manufacturing were not being developed solely inside military bases. They were being built by private aerospace corporations, defense contractors, and research conglomerates operating within black budget ecosystems that answer to no single nation. This is where the balance of power began to shift. Corporate entities do not think in terms of defense or sovereignty. They think in terms of scalability and also profit, longevity, and control of infrastructure. Once off-world operations proved viable, corporations recognized something the military could not openly acknowledge. Space was not just a battlefield, it was an economy. Resources, manufacturing potential, strategic positioning, and long-term dominance mattered far more than patrol routes or defensive postures. Intelligence agencies saw this shift even earlier. Unlike the military, intelligence structures specialize in secrecy, narrative management, psychological operations, and long-term manipulation. Their power does not come from force alone, but from information control. As the scope of off-world activity expanded, intelligence agencies became indispensable, not just for secrecy, but for managing what humanity was allowed to know and believe or dismiss. At this point, military control became a liability. A disciplined fleet like Solar Warden was predictable. It followed rules. It operated within defined perimeters. It asked for authorization. Corporate and intelligent interests do not operate that way. They thrive in ambiguity, plausible deniability, and layers of separation that make accountability impossible. The more complex the secret space program became, the less compatible it was with traditional military governance. Technology accelerated this transition. As propulsion systems, artificial intelligence, automation, and consciousness-adjacent research advanced, the focus of power shifted away from uniform command structures and towards those who owned the patents, controlled the labs, and dictated access. Whoever controlled the technology controlled the program. And increasingly, that was not the military. Another critical factor was jurisdiction. Military authority is tied to nations, laws, and chains of command. Off-world operations exist in a legal vacuum. No constitution, no treaty, no civilian oversight meaningfully applies beyond Earth. This vacuum created the perfect environment for corporate and intelligence dominance. They could operate globally, post-nationally, and eventually off-planet. without legal consequence. Over time, Solar Warden's role began to narrow. It still existed, it still operated, but it no longer defined the direction of expansion. Corporate programs began establishing independent infrastructure. Intelligence agencies embedded themselves deeper into every layer of secrecy. New factions emerged that were not bound by military ethics, defensive mandates, or even allegiances to Earth-based populations. This is where the idea of a breakaway civilization stops being metaphorical. Once corporate and intelligence interests overtook military control, the secret space program ceased to be an extension of Earth governance and became something else entirely, a parallel power structure, one that evolves according to its own incentives, priorities, and timelines. And this is why disclosure becomes such a problem. Military secrecy can, in theory, be classified. Governments change. Archives open. Oversight can be forced. But corporate secrecy is protected indefinitely. Intelligence operations are designed to erase trails, discredit witnesses, and shape perception. When these two forces dominate off-world activity, disclosure is no longer about releasing information, it's about dismantling an entire hidden power structure. This also reframes why Solar Warden is often portrayed as the marginalized or sidelined in later accounts. It wasn't because it failed, it was because it no longer fit. It represented a model of power that could not survive in an environment defined by secrecy, without accountability, technology without transparency, and expansion without consent. And once that shift occurred, the trajectory of the secret space program changed permanently. What began as a defensive extension of Earth's military logic evolved into something far more opaque, far more autonomous, and far more disconnected from the population whose future it was shaping. Understanding this transition is essential because it explains why modern disclosure feels fragmented, manipulated, and contradictory. It explains why some narratives emphasize fear, others emphasize salvation, and others emphasize inevitability. Those are not accidents. They are artifacts of a system that is no longer governed by defense, but by control. And once you see that, the question of disclosure stops being about aliens entirely. It becomes about power, who holds it, who hides it, and whether humanity will ever be allowed to reclaim it. What you've just heard isn't meant to convince you of a belief. It's meant to expand the frame of reality you're allowed to question. The secret space program isn't about spectacle or fear, and it isn't about replacing one story with another. It's about understanding how power, secrecy, technology, and consciousness quietly shape the future of humanity beyond public awareness. Solar Warden represents the moment this hidden system crossed a threshold, when space stopped being a shared human horizon and became a classified domain. And once that line was crossed, control didn't remain with the military for long. In the next episode, we're going to follow that shift directly and examine the faction that embodies it, the interplanetary corporate conglomerate, where space becomes an economy, secrecy becomes privatized, and the real mechanics of off-world power began to reveal themselves. Machiwa.